Chances are, if you've been watching any sort of high quality advertisements over the past few years, you've heard some of Kevin Graham's work, one of the industry's top young composers. And when it comes to that hard hitting cinematic emotion, he's that dude. And today we get to hear his story on the Steps podcast. As creative professionals, we all have that moment where we took the leap into the dream and into the unknown. But there were steps before and after that moment that tell the full story. This podcast attempts to relive those moments, the steps taken, and the lessons learned along the way for an entertaining and educational experience. This is the Steps Podcast. Kevin, welcome to the Steps Podcast as our first guest, actually. Such a pleasure. I'm going to give you a quick introduction for our listeners. About 3 to 4 years ago, I was looking for some music to use in some promotional materials and kind of tired of like the typical royalty-free, happy, clappy corporate music tracks that I'd been using for actually many years. And I came across this guy who was just crushing it with every song and so dynamic and full and just a pleasure to listen to, which was rare. And that guy was Kevin Graham. And over the past couple of years, we've teamed up on many projects and partnerships, actually. And today, we get to hear a little bit about his story. So, Kevin, thanks for being on. And tell us just maybe like a little intro about yourself, the basics, where you're from, business, family, kids, pets, that kind of thing.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And thanks for the kind words about the music. That's always been my goal. It's been to not like make stuff sound like stock. So yeah. I'm glad that translated there. But yeah, no, I'm 28 and I live in Eastern Washington, so Spokane, closer to Idaho than to Seattle for people that may not know the state. And I'm married, don't have any kids yet, but have a couple dogs that we probably give too much love and attention to. And that's kind of my situation right now. I'm a professional full-time working composer for licensing and media and film, and I love every minute of it.
Nice. Yeah, and part of like what I love talking to creative professionals about is like the steps that got them to the point they are now. And so I've kind of broke it into like 5 steps, and they're not always in this order, and sometimes someone's path looks differently than someone else's. But for me, it's like step 1 is like introduction. Step 2 is the development and refining of your craft. Step 3 is like that leap, that moment where you got to take a risk. Step 4 is the grind after that of like making it happen. And then step 5 is the reward. And that's kind of like that's a tough one. And it's tough. You don't really maybe even know that you're in it when you're in it. But so let's go to step 1. Could you maybe like tell me about the introduction to your craft? Maybe your first exposure to the music realm.
For sure. Not that there's, I guess, a standard way for somebody to get into writing music for a living, but I feel like I definitely had a little bit of a unique path to get to this point. Like growing up, all I ever did was play guitar. Guitar was my thing. I was in bands all in high school. I loved like heavy music and metal and rock and stuff. And
a lot of electric guitar.
Yeah, electric guitar. I have an acoustic guitar. I can mess around on it, but electric guitar is kind of my main comfort zone there. And yeah, I fell in love with that instrument. I think probably because my dad played acoustic guitar. There was always a guitar laying around the house when I was little, so I would always mess around with it. I took like piano lessons when I was younger, but I didn't have the attention span for that.
Yeah, that helps so much too. It helps so much too when you can have, I think, like either a friend or a parent or a sibling who's kind of like paving the way a little bit. I feel like that can really help. And not everyone has that. Honestly, I think part of my story is I didn't really like have that, but I wish I had. Yeah. And it sounds like you did. And so that's really cool. Shout out to Dad for doing that.
Yeah, and I took lessons, and the lessons was the what I credit for sort of like introducing me into just music in general. I mean, I learned theory on a fretboard, not on like a keyboard, which is kind of backwards for a lot of people. And
Tough.
I got a degree at in audio technology because I wanted to be able to, apply that towards being a session guitarist or whatever. And through that, I got an internship and then a job at a production house, a production studio here in town doing post-production audio work. Because that
And
was
how
like,
old are you at this point?
I was like 19. This
Okay,
is
pretty young.
almost a day. Yeah. And because, back then, like I couldn't, there was like 2 recording studios in town. Again, Spokane's not a large metropolitan area. I couldn't see a way to like make a living just writing music at that point. And just getting this internship, I didn't know anything about, filmmaking or the production world or post-production. And I learned like so much doing that. I eventually got hired there to do that. Started diving into the actual visual side of things, filmmaking and cinematography and editing and stuff like that. And that kind of like launched I would say 7 or 8 year to at this point career in filmmaking, which ended up being kind of my main day job. I ended up starting a company with a business partner, running that for a while. Because at least that was something where I could like, provide for myself and my family doing. And then I was still doing all the music stuff, basically just on the side. It was always like my passion and what I love to do, but just couldn't at that point find a way to make that work and be my full-time thing. I'm like a very risk averse person. Like I'm not the type of person to just, and maybe then I should have, since I was so young, I didn't have as many, obligations, but.
So you were getting maybe paid, or it was maybe easier in some ways to have a career in video and kind of that multimedia side versus composing and songwriting. And I see that too. I feel like it's super competitive. I mean, a lot of the creative professions are very competitive, but when I think of making music, it seems like almost everybody wants to do that. Like that's kind of the dream,
It's loud out
and so
there.
I guess it is. Yep. It can feel saturated, but I feel like there's always room for people. And this goes into a lot of, I think, industries. There's always room for someone who's willing to be innovative and really to pursue excellence. Like there is a place for you. And so I guess tell me about a little bit of like maybe that leap you made from like the safety net, let's call it, of like the video and multimedia creation into like, hey, jumping into music. Tell me a little bit about that leap, especially for someone who's risk averse like yourself.
Yeah.
Like, how did that feel? How did you do that? How did you take that step?
Yeah. And there were, I guess, a bunch of mini leaps to get to that point. Like for me, it wasn't just one big leap. I mean, like if I'm just thinking of like big moments or milestones, like while I was still an intern at that production house, I scored my first commercial, like, so that was cool. Just being like, hey, like I just got paid. I made like $200 to score this commercial, but like I did it and it like got accepted by the client and it's, being on air and stuff. Like when you're like a 19-year-old kid who like just learned about Pro Tools the year before, that's like just that sort of gratification is everything.
Yeah. And I think I can resonate with that as well. Like I remember my first paid video project and it was like exhilarating. I think it was $500 that I got for this like massive edit. It was like, it took me so long and I had to drive 2 hours back and forth to go get this hard drive and so many revisions. It was a huge, many hours sunk into that. My hourly rate was very small, but it was the first time in my life that I actually got paid to do something like, to have some creative freedom, some creative expression, and then getting paid for it. And that was a small amount. It was that was a really like monumental shift for me in my mindset of like, hey, if I can find one person to pay for my skill set, I bet I can find some more.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Just knowing that what you're doing is can bring value to other people and you're not just doing it for yourself, I think is a huge sort of booster in like it's like, hey, now I feel comfortable dedicating a lot more time and energy to doing this if I know that, it could potentially be something that makes sense for me to do. Um, like there was another time, like a couple years later, I won an American Advertising Federation award for a custom score that I did for a short film, which was cool. Just again, that sort of like, not that those sort of subjective awards or anything means anything, but it lets you know that you're on the right path. Like what I'm doing isn't
Totally.
totally terrible because somebody liked it. But I think like the biggest thing that just let me really realize that I could someday do this, full time for a living was like, as a lot of sort of more affordable licensing platforms became available to filmmakers, which to me shifted the dynamic of like the production music landscape significantly, probably over the last
Yep.
7 years. Like that same dynamic is happening for songwriters and composers. Like not only is really high end music becoming very available to filmmakers on platforms like FilmPac where they can get music, but like those avenues are becoming more widely available for composers, where before that you would have to be with a major record label, or you'd have to be one of the like very select few people on a super high end licensing site where they're basically sending you briefs and you're doing everything work for hire. So just like when I started to see interest and getting paid just putting my music out there for licensing and seeing that people actually had a demand for it and they started using it, that was the main thing that spurred me to be like, hey, this is something that I should really be pouring like a lot of time into, and I think I can make it work.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love to hear that. And let's I guess I want to kind of take a step back and think about your day to day, or maybe your week to week, or even month to month. Like maybe talk about some of the harder, more difficult aspects of being a creative professional. I think sometimes we can get caught up in talking about, the cool stuff and the
Yeah.
awards and the ad placements and stuff. But there's a really hard side of being a creative professional. And I've got to experience a lot of that, I know, and I'll share some of mine as well throughout this series. But I guess for you, my question is, maybe walk us through some of those like more difficult aspects of maybe working for yourself or being a composer and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, I think any creative work that you do, there's going to be a little element of this that I deal with. And it's just like being your own worst critic, being like a perfectionist. Like those are two of my, I think, biggest faults. Like I'm very much sometimes get sucked into the like imposter syndrome world where you're just like, it seems like you're never going to write a good note ever again, and everybody else is just out there absolutely crushing it. But then I'll go back and listen to that project, a month later, and it's like, that was good. I don't know what I was thinking. It's really easy to compare yourself to others and to sort of just like nitpick your work to the point of it not even being productive anymore. And it's just sort of like you probably know as a filmmaker and an editor, like sometimes you just have to know when to walk away from like an edit or like an animation.
Yes, I think too and this is something that I try to communicate to young creatives, is like pursuing excellence. That's good. That's a good thing. Perfectionism is just paralyzing.
Yeah.
It's paralysis. And I actually, my story is a little bit unique, that I came at filmmaking from a business like perspective. I actually graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in corporate finance. So I do nothing like that. I hardly even can look at a balance sheet anymore. But I think one mentality I took to my my craft was thinking business first. And I knew that once you get into that like perfectionist mindset, you just lose so much time and so many hours, and then it's tough to be profitable. I mean, just from a practical standpoint, it's tough to be profitable. And I think it's tough. Sometimes you just got to know when to cut, when to stop, and just move on to the next thing. So I can relate with that. I try to be super aware of when I'm getting into that like perfectionist region and just like stop, dial it back, move on.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. And it's, for me, I think it's easily my biggest fault, because it's so much easier said than done. Like talking about it right now in an interview versus when I'm halfway through a project and I've got, 50 tracks going. I'm just like, man, I really thought this was going to turn out different. Like I could walk away from this now, but what if I just do this one more thing? And then, 7 hours later, I'm still just like adding. But yeah, I think in our industry in particular, which is creating media for licensing use, like there has to be that you have to find that line between those two things, between making something that's your own and unique and like working to your strengths, but also just creating a workflow and like a process that makes sense to where you can just be profitable at it and it makes sense financially or from a business model perspective. I mean, I used to make like an album a year. Like that's how much time I would take with stuff. And it was great, and like when that was just this random little supplementary thing I was doing on the side, but I like loved doing it. It was awesome. But then as I started to get sort of more entrenched in the world of writing music for a living and making these other relationships with other composers and learning how they work and even working, taking on more and more licensing gigs and sort of having to force myself I remember there being a very clear disconnect or a very clear moment where like I started just writing a lot, making myself write a lot of music, like write music every single week. Whereas before, like I would just let things always come to me. I would never stress anything. And all of a sudden I'm finding myself having to actively just think of ideas. And if I can't think of an idea, just pull up some random patches on the keyboard and mess around with them until I think of something and then just do that. And I think that helped me grow as a composer a lot, to be able to write music faster and learn more, and not necessarily like sacrifice quality, but just teach myself, mentally that, hey, like not everything has to be in your mind just like a perfect work of art. Like there's going to be a need for it and value for it with content creators, as long as you just do your due diligence in making it useful to them.
Yeah, and I think kind of along the same lines as that is one thing I've felt is sometimes some really interesting creative work has come out of having really limited constraints too, of like a limited time, or like in your case maybe it's a limited amount of sounds or patches. Yep. Or plugins, and like all of a sudden you're forced to like make something cool out of very little. It's time, resources, money, whatever. So that's been something that's fun to look back over the years and look back at some old projects and be able to just tell stories about like, oh, this one video that has gotten like so many views and likes and has got me so many jobs. Literally, I shot that in one afternoon with, my baby boy or something at the park. Like that's one video actually that I did. And so, yeah, it's interesting what inspires certain creativity. One thing I wanted to ask about is like, and this is a point where actually I want you to brag like a little bit. I want you to tell, for our listeners, like what is something at least that you feel like you personally do really well, or something that you do exceptionally and that has contributed to your success and has got you to where you are now. And this, like I said, this isn't a time to really be humble. Don't be shy. I want to hear, and I want you to be able to share with our listeners maybe something that that you've been able to accomplish, or some sort of work ethic or something like that, something that you're really good at.
Sure. I mean, I do think I have definitely like in just inherent talent at being creative, like at creatively telling a story. Like I've always been, I think, good at writing, just physically writing. Um, I feel as though I can pretty seamlessly convey like ideas from my mind into something tangible, whether it's like a edit that I'm working on, back in the day for video, or like now like a music track. Like I do think I have that inherent talent, but I think my strongest attribute that really has helped me get to this point and do what I do is just like I'm like so incredibly stubborn. Um, going back to that sort of perfectionism, like I'm very stubborn with myself, and I just like sometimes will refuse to let a track out the door until I know that it's ready. And it doesn't mean that it takes a lot of time. Like part of that learning has been to like, be able to figure out quickly what's wrong with the track and like quickly fix it. And maybe the solution is to just take out this element. Like I can't get this one particular instrument to work. I'm just going to take it out. Whereas before, maybe I would have tried to like double it or layer it or spend 8 hours on it. But I think I'm very stubborn at just not ever letting that quality level dip, at least in my mind and my perception. And also, I'm willing to like put in the grind and the work. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are willing to work hard, and I don't think it's like a super unique thing, but it's just it's something that I think I've noticed about myself, that I'm willing to, stay up late and get up early and just do what I need to do to make it happen. Because I mean, again, before the last year and a half or so, like music wasn't like, I had like a full day job that wasn't even music. Like music was just early mornings, late nights, weekends, a lot of free time and effort and energy being poured into that when, my friends are all out having fun and stuff. Like, I'm not saying that you have to become like a hermit and just shut yourself away, but I do think there's just a certain amount of time that you have to spend on a craft like writing music in order to just get to a point where you can translate it into giving you more opportunities. So I don't know. Is that a good answer? I guess stubbornness and a hard work ethic would be my main things.
Yeah, it's always kind of a mixed bag, right? It's like the things that probably make you good at what you do are also kind of what make you bad, or it can be hurdles as well. It's funny when you were saying that. I had a memory too of when I was getting started making videos, and I was working full time, normal like a desk job, finance, whatever, that kind of stuff. And I'd come home at night and be working on videos and creating stuff. I'd be up till like midnight, 1, 2 a.m. Sometimes I was getting up at like then 4 a.m. to like get in like a half day or almost a full day of video work prior to my normal work. And looking around at some of my friends who are just living it up, and maybe they're still in grad school or college, and I was, relatively young, I guess, still. And tough, man. It's the hard work, though. I guess that is one probably common thread through any of the creative professionals that we'll probably talk to on this podcast. It's just always work ethic. Like there has to be. I don't think you can make it as a like career creative professional without a strong work ethic. That doesn't mean you can't be talented. You can be very talented and you can do it on the side for fun or whatever. And that's great. And hey, for some people, maybe that's the way to go. But if you really want to make a career out of it, it takes a lot of grit and hard work. So you kind of answered what my next question was going to be, was, saying something that you could get better at, could improve at. So I guess one thing I wanted to ask you, I feel like there's probably a lot of listeners that would look to your position, or maybe even my position, and be like, hey, how do I get to where Kevin is in 5 years? So my question to you is like, maybe what advice would you give Kevin Jr. or little Kevin 5 years ago? What advice would you give? What would you tell that person?
Sure. I'll give a general one and a specific one. Like in general, I think what I would tell 5 years ago Kevin is just stop, like, don't sell yourself short, and don't be afraid to try to push your music out there more. Like, not necessarily just, shameless self promotion or posting about, but like there were so many like libraries I'd never submitted anything to, so many opportunities I never even tried to get my foot in the door with, just because in my mind I'm like, I'm not there yet. But like now looking back, it's like maybe I was like, I just like the more ingrained in this industry I get, and the more relationships I build, and the more people I meet, it's like it's such like music creation as a whole today, and even just the music licensing or music for video industry, it's so fluid, it's changing so much. Like even everybody who like has made it and knows what they're doing, like they're still figuring it out as they're going along. Like there's just I was always waiting for like this perfect time of like, all right, like now I'm a good composer, now I can start trying to like send my music everywhere. Like I don't think that moment ever comes. I think you just have to believe in what you're doing, and if you feel that what you're doing will bring value to other creatives in their projects, then there's no better time than yesterday to try to make that happen.
Right.
And just super specifically, I'll hammer home again, like don't be afraid to make music that isn't coming from like the absolute most amazing purest place of inspiration. Like you don't have to wait for something to just fully come together in your mind over the course of a year before you go start creating it. Like challenge yourself to, even if you're starting out, hey, I want to make a track a month, and then try to make a track a week, and then try to make 3 tracks a week, and see if you can figure out a workflow and your tools and get all your sounds dialed in to be able to do that consistently at a high quality level. You're only going to be making yourself more, profitable and more useful to anybody else who would want to use your music.
There's a quote that my brother, he sent me a couple years ago, and it really resonated with me, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but I think it said, the test of a true professional is whether they can create excellent work even when they're not inspired. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. Is like sometimes you get the gift of inspiration and you're just rolling, and you just get lost in whatever project you're working on. Other times, and for me, it feels like most times, especially over the last few years, it's you just having to grind, and you're just having to just make stuff, even though you're tired, you got creative fatigue, all that. You just got to grind and make something happen.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah,
because it's just I once worked for a brief time in a music production studio with a very, very good high end composer doing all sorts of stuff for like trailers and stuff. And one of his favorite quotes was, "If I wanted art, I would have called him." Like his whole thing was just like anybody can sit there and like take inspiration and make something awesome, but like what if you really want to make it in this industry, like that skill set that you have to learn over time is doing exactly what you just said, being able to still deliver at a high level when that inspiration isn't just like flowing into your mind. Like, I have some tracks that write themselves. I'm sure you have some projects or that shoot themselves or edit themselves, but for every one of those, there's 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 ones where you just have to grind and find a way to, I don't want to say like fool them, like fake it, but just find a way to keep that quality high, even during those times when it's not just like the easiest, most inspiring thing. So I think that translates music, video across the board.
Yeah, agreed. Speaking of like those kinds of projects, maybe I'm curious, like what's your, looking back at maybe your past, I don't know, 5 or it's almost 10 years now. What would you say is like your most fulfilling project that you've done?
My most fulfilling project, I'll give you 2 of them. I did a project, the first project I ever did specifically with the intent of having it used in videos. And it ended up having a decent amount of, success in licensing, was probably my most fulfilling project. It was a little collection of 5 sort of epic tracks called Apex. And just because it was the first project I ever wrote going into it, not just wanting to like write music that I thought was cool, but just going into it thinking like, I want this stuff to be used in like a bunch of videos. Like I want this to be used in like epic videos. And writing that and then having it have the success that it had, and seeing some of the projects that use some of these tracks. I mean, you're talking, stuff from like Bugatti and Kia and Major League Soccer, like just these high end brands use these tracks. When that was my goal when I was going in, just seeing that thing sort of tie together and come full circle for me personally was really fulfilling. And then there's another, just a personal project I did back in 2019, where it was just, at that point, that was my first year of really grinding and doing a ton of like licensing work and library work and production work. And I hadn't really written any music besides that for a year and a half, which that was kind of the first time in my life where I'd gone that long without just creating anything for myself. So I did a project, back in 2019, just called Montana, where it was just, I think it was just 3 tracks, just some ideas that I had. And I didn't give myself any expectations or limits or anything. And those turned out good. Like, it's just, I find that every now and then you just have to do something like that. You have to just get some creative energy out of your system. You have to sort of get some of those ideas out. And then that way you feel sort of like more refreshed and rejuvenated to jump back into the grind of doing all these other things. So I just remember, writing that album was just like a sort of a big creative release, which was awesome. I think we had a couple of those songs even play at our wedding the next year. So nice. found some use for
them. Speaking of like experience, I guess, tell me maybe like about one of your bigger fails, that we talked about, like things you need that you feel like you could work on or improve on. But like, I guess I'm curious, like a specific instance where you just like a massive failure. And now this could be funny, or maybe more on the serious side. But I guess I love watching like fail videos, just like capturing little moments of people's biggest fails of their life. I'm curious, like when you look back at your, career thus far, like what's like a big fail?
Man, I'm trying to think of one that'll play well on the podcast. Cause I've got, I mean, we've all as like in the world of filmmaking, we've all like shown up to set and like left all the batteries or cards or whatever at back at the studio or whatever. But I'm trying to think of a music related one. I mean, like I've created such terrible music before.
Like in your early days or still now, you feel
early days. I mean, I like the studio that I was interning at. I like did a ton of work to sort of take their system that they had there and like try to turn it into like a full on 16 track, like recording studio. I think we had like 24 tracks of IO there. And I had this like whole like scheme set up to where I could like monitor everything upstairs in this control room. And then I like built we ran a snake, which is just a ton of audio cables consolidated into one big cable down into this big open space on the main floor where I wanted to record like live drums and, strings or whatever. And like, we got it all up and running. And like, I did a few sessions and it was the worst sounding room ever because it was just this big open room. And I was still like, I don't know. I don't know if I just hadn't got to that point in my degree or school where you learn that like acoustics do actually matter when you have a big space. But
yes.
So I don't know. I spent a lot of time trying to get that space tuned into being like a full on recording studio. And after about 4, demo sessions with bands, it was very clear that it was not going to happen. And I should probably just get really good at virtual instruments instead. Wow. That's the only specific one I can think of.
Yeah, that's good. I have like so many when I think through. I'll share mine on a different podcast, on a different episode. But I guess I'm thinking to someone who's maybe listening to this and they're like, man, they're getting ready to graduate college or whatever, wherever they're at in life. And they're thinking like, hey man, I'm willing, I want to like pursue this. Maybe, could you say maybe like, not to scare someone away, but like maybe what's one risk or one reward, but I think I'm more concerned about like what's one risk that they may not be considering, and like so they're not surprised when they hit it. Like what's maybe one risk that you felt that was, you know, maybe a surprise to you or something like that.
Sure. I think maybe one thing that somebody just getting into this industry, like, I don't know if it's necessarily a risk, but definitely something that they may not understand or consider until they get into it, is just like how rapidly things change and how rapidly the landscape of the industry evolves on so many different fronts, whether or not it's the specific, like even getting into like just the specific avenues you have to sell your music on. Like those are always coming and going. Things are always changing with the way that companies are working and how they're sourcing their material. But even just more on a macro scale of just content, like content is changing. I mean, 10 years ago, if a 2-minute video was considered short, now it's considered like 4 times too long and nobody wants to watch it. Like just, 10 years ago, TikTok didn't exist. 10 years ago, Facebook and Instagram were still kind of in their infant stages. They weren't even under the same company yet. Like there's so many things that evolve in the landscape of content creating that has a very direct effect on music creators for content, that you just have to be willing to like be very flexible and to always be learning and to always be making a point to like have your finger on the pulse of the industry and to be learning.
Yeah.
That's my main thing. Like, because I just assume that's like, oh, I'll become a music maker and then I'll just make a bunch of music and that's it. It'll be like that forever, happy ever after. But it's just, it changes all the time, man.
It's true. And I think like the sad part you see sometimes, and I see this in my industry, and I'm sure you see it too, is dudes who are maybe like crushing it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but they lost touch, right? They lost the pulse
100%.
on where things were heading and what's contemporary. And you can tell everything that they output is old fashioned. It's just
100%.
Out of style. And it's like, it's sad because man, they were so good in their heyday, but man, they just didn't keep up. And so that's something like almost, that's like it's a fear of mine. Like, and I try to like gather as much data as I can from different platforms, social media, Vimeo, YouTube, what's happening on TV, even into like, podcasts and where radio is headed, all this, like try to gather. And so I have a really good idea of where content is headed and what is it sounding like and what is it looking like. And so, yep, I think you're right on with that one. It's always changing. You gotta stay up with it. Well, tell me a last question for you is like the dream. I don't know, 5 years, 10 years from now, or whatever your dream horizon is. Like, where would you like to see yourself? What would you like to see yourself doing 5, 10, 20 years from now?
Are we talking professionally or just in general?
I'm talking professionally.
Yeah, probably just professionally. I mean, I think most of my goal things like that are just internally, like where I would like to be with growing as a composer. Like at this point, I'm a full-time working professional composer. I hope to still be doing that, in 10 years from now in the same, I hope to be just still putting as much of myself into my craft then as I am now. But man, it's hard to place tangibles on it. There's just, because I think of my abilities 10 years ago and I'm like, man, I was terrible. And so I wonder if in 10 years from now, I'm going to look back on where I'm right now and be like, man, I was terrible. Like, I hope I do. Yeah.
One thing I think
I'm trying to give you something tangible. I just can't.
Yeah. Well, one thing I was kind of hearing there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like, even how you let off your answer with like, hey, is this a professional, more personal? And I think it's hard to distinguish. I think if my professional goal was to be the next Christopher Nolan, that would impact my personal life, I think. And I think what you said is like, hey, I'm a, career composer. And like, in some ways you've kind of already made it. Like, how do you just, maintain it? And I think that's a good thing to consider. I think for a lot of people as they're getting into this is because the higher your professional aspirations are, the greater impact it's going to have, I think, on your personal life too. And I think for me, at this point in my life, I don't have the goal of being like some major big blockbuster movie director. I think that there's some people that can balance that with like their personal hobbies and family life and all of that. To me, like my personal life and my family, investing into my wife and my kids and my community is a very high priority. And I limit what, sacrifices I'm willing to make on the professional side to get there. So, I think I like your answer. It's kind of like, hey, how do we just keep this thing going? Because it's, and I know you personally a little bit too, is you have a good, personal and professional life balance, I feel like. And that's something we haven't touched on, but I think it's super important and it's healthy for your creative mindset, I think, as well too, when you can bring in like real life experiences. I felt that. Yeah. I know when I've gotten I've had seasons where it's like a couple, 70, 80-hour weeks in a row, and you're so just done after that, so exhausted. And I sometimes after like a weekend or a good weekend or even a long vacation, I come back and I'm like, hey man, I'm ready to roll. And I got some ideas. I'm bringing in, it's a little bit abstract, but I'm bringing in some life experiences into this, this next project or this next song. And so I actually like that.
Yeah. That's why I asked, are we talking professional or personal? Because to me, they go hand in hand. I mean, just to piggyback off that real quick. Yeah. Like, I don't like, a lot of people are like, man, you're going to be scoring movies someday, or like, you should move to Hollywood. Like, I don't have any intention. Like, I'm not trying to become the next Hans Zimmer. I'm not trying to become the next John Williams. It's just not on my radar. Like, I just want to be me, and who I am is somebody who, like you said, I make, my family's very important to me. My family life is very important to me. That's probably why I've always been very risk averse, financially. But yeah, I want to, if I can find a way to be me and not Hans Zimmer, but still provide value to others with what I do and provide for myself and for my family using that value, then that is the dream for me. And if I feel that's like I'm working hard towards that right now. And if that's still the case in 10 years, I'll be very happy.
Thank you for listening to the Steps podcast. We're so glad you're here. Please subscribe and rate this podcast if you love it. If you hate it, maybe just keep it to yourself. We'll be back next week right here with more awesome content on the Steps podcast.